everybody. Welcome to our attendees and our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm Katie Sandoval-Clark, Fly's Vice President of Development, and we're very excited to host you for our second installment of the Movement for Justice series. This series is a space for Fly to share with you and answer your questions about the pressing issues that our youth and our communities and our systems partners are facing right now, and how Fly is getting involved and equipping our young people to use their voices to create positive change. We're so thankful that you're here tonight. We have a wonderful group of panelists to talk about prioritizing school safety so that all of our young people can engage with their education in a safe and supportive environment. So without further ado, I will pass it on to Fly's President and CEO, Ali Knight.
Thanks, Katie. Good evening. Thank you for joining us and participating in tonight's conversation about prioritizing school safety. I'm excited to introduce tonight's panelists and get to the meat of our conversation. But first, I want to provide a little bit of context. There's a growing awareness in our society that there is a pipeline to prison for youth. The pipeline is a powerful and very appropriate metaphor representing a series of decisions and practices that push kids into the justice system. The overwhelming majority of these kids are youth of color, youth from low-income, under-resourced communities, LGBTQ+ youth, youth with disabilities, youth who are undocumented or whose immigration status is uncertain. In other words, Fly's youth, our kids, those who are disproportionately represented at every point in the juvenile justice system. And as we know it, is a gateway to the adult criminal justice system. Schools often serve as a starting point for the pipeline, hence the term school to prison pipeline. School policies, practices, and priorities can create the conditions for learning and thriving, or they can facilitate a youth's entry into the justice system. And police officers, often known as school resource officers, play a key role in keeping the school to prison pipeline operating. There's a growing movement for police-free schools. Although this has been a decade-long fight, it didn't really grow to national awareness until the murder of George Floyd last year. As of June, at least 35 school districts across the country have taken steps to end policing in their schools. It's also critical to note that harmful disparities in school discipline often begins in the classroom. When it comes to school safety, teachers are on the front line, literally, and they serve as the catalyst for student support or student dismissal. When combined with zero tolerance policies, a teacher's decision to refer students to punishment can mean they're pushed into the pipeline, especially if police are on campus. Students who return after being locked up are particularly vulnerable. They're quite often labeled as troublemakers, violent, a nuisance, or unworthy of attention. This is part of the reason why they're more likely to drop out or reoffend. But there is hope. A new Stanford study on the Alameda County Juvenile Hall showed that a simple thing, like having kids write letters to their teachers upon their return to school, could have huge impacts on their success. To provide examples of what kids are saying in these letters, one kid wrote, "I'm a good kid." Another admitted, "I have a bad attitude and get bored easily." Other students described liking math, but having trouble focusing or needing more one-on-one time. Some had goals as simple as graduating middle school or as ambitious as attending college. These excerpts were taken from a recently published article about the study by award-winning journalist, author, and friend of Fly, Sylvia A. Harvey. She notes that the letters led to a more positive student-teacher relationship, which reduced the likelihood that students would reoffend. This is just one powerful and simple example of an intervention for youth who might otherwise remain caught in a pipeline. But now I'll turn to our panelists who will bring a community's perspective on how to prioritize school safety while disrupting the school-to-prison pipeline. We'll also hear more about Fly's role in promoting school safety and our efforts to elevate youth voice as part of this important debate and the decisions that follow. So I want to first introduce It's my pleasure. I'm very proud to introduce Jamila Joseph, FLY's Alameda County Director. A native and current Oakland resident, Jamila is a leader who is dedicated to using her passion, experiences, and relationships to make meaningful change in her community. She spent the past 10 years working professionally in the community with youth. 9 of those years, I'm proud to say, with FLY. 6 years ago, she helped FLY expand to Alameda County by leading the on-the-ground effort. And FLY's service imprint and community presence in Alameda has grown significantly under her leadership. Jamila holds a Bachelor of Arts from Howard University and a Master of Science in Organizational Development from the University of San Francisco. Welcome, Jamila. Second, my pleasure to introduce Ivan Nathan Garcia. Ivan represents the voice of Bay Area youth and is someone who is very familiar with FLY. Ivan is a first-year student at UC Davis studying political science and government. Raised in the Oakland community, he has drawn his activism from witnessing the deep disparities and inequalities within his city and experiencing many of them himself. This is how he came to understand the root causes of violence and institutional issues. In 2020, Ivan was appointed to Oakland's Reimagining Public Safety Task Force, one of 2 youth members. He also served as the co-chair for the Youth Advisory Board, an offshoot of the task force, which FLY helped facilitate. Throughout this process, Ivan found it incredibly important to center the voice of those most affected by the issues of policing and public safety. Welcome, Ivan. Finally, later we'll be joined by Ebony Cinnamon Johnson. We're honored to have Ebony join us tonight. She's a Bay Area native currently residing in Oakland. She's a forensic social worker with the Alameda County Bar Association, working with youth and families involved in a juvenile injustice system. A former therapist and teacher in Oakland's Unified School District. She is also an associate with the Beta Change Consultant, an Oakland-based firm that provides trainings and coaching on anti-racism and youth development. She serves as an adjunct professor for the University of San Francisco School of Education, Urban Education, and Social Justice, where she teaches disability, critical race studies to new teachers. Ebony is a lifelong mentor for young Black women and girls. We look forward to welcoming Ebony when she's able to join in a couple of minutes. So, with that said, I want to get into this conversation, and we're going to start with Jamila. I've got a few questions prepared, but we want the audience to be involved too. So what I'll ask you to do is, if a question comes up, feel free to add it in the Q&A function. We'll be sure to try to get to all of them when we move to the audience Q&A after we go through our prepared questions. Sounds good? Right on. Let's start with Jamila. Jamila, how are you?
I'm good, Ali. How are you?
Good, good. Good to see you, even though you're like 2 offices away from me.
That's how it is.
So, you know, as I mentioned, Jamila, you've been with FLY for several years in a variety of programmatic roles. So from your perspective, what does prioritizing school safety look like for FLY, or look like at FLY?
Yeah. Thanks for that grounding question, Ali. While this topic can be really complex, my answer is really not. Prioritizing school safety to us looks like building strong relationships. And relationships have really always been at the core of everything that we do in our programming, everything we do at FLY. And so I think it's really important that we start this conversation off with that, relationships, because we cannot talk about it enough. And our youth will tell you this. If you talk to our youth about what they appreciate about programming, they'll say, you know, it was cool to have somebody to talk to. It was cool to have somebody to listen to me, someone who I can trust. And so relationships is really at the core when we're talking about school safety. But just to share a little example to kind of paint a picture of what school safety and relationship looks like to us, I just want to share a story that I'm thinking about now, you asking this question. We were working with 2 youth in our leadership program, and these youth attended the same school. They got into an altercation one day with one another, and it was off campus, but near the school grounds. Because of the altercation and the dialogue that was exchanged, the school administration saw this as a huge safety risk, which was understandable. A lot of times conversations could happen and escalate to violence in the schools or in the community. But this teacher decided to expel the student. And so the student had to go through an expulsion hearing. But when we found out about this, because both of these youth are in our program, right? We immediately brought them together and engaged them in dialogue, and they had conversation and they squashed it. So meanwhile, this other youth is still having to go through the expulsion hearing, all the while they're working on building their relationship with the same youth in which this incident caused them to go through this expulsion hearing. And so, you know, just imagining when we're thinking about school to prison pipeline, that's it right there. That's it. And so, you know, fortunately, this youth, because of the way that they advocated for themselves, because of their willingness to engage in dialogue and to really deepen their relationship with this youth, as opposed to just blocking it out and not being done with it or going a different route, they decided to really lean into that. And with our support, these youth ended up at a community service event together the next day after this. And this really helped to ensure that there wasn't violence happening in the community, violence happening on campus. Unfortunately, they were expelled, and we were at both of these youth graduation. And so again, when we're talking about safety in school, it looks like relationships between our young people, but also, you know, the adults that are supporting them.
I love it. I love it. It's such a great example of, you know, kids in a lot of ways being kids and it turning into something much more complex and quite honestly, like the pipeline at work. So thank you for sharing that story. So a follow-up question for you, Jamila. You know, we're going to hear a little bit more from Ivan about the Reimagining Public Safety Task Force, but Fly played some role in that. In a lot of ways, I think that, you know, it signals Fly's role evolving from a direct service organization to one that convenes and coordinates space to elevate community and youth voice. And you helped lead that on Fly's side. Can you take some time to speak specifically about Fly's role in the City of Oakland's Reimagining Public Safety Task Force?
Yes. Well, this is exciting to talk about. And really because of the relationships that we have with some of the highest need youth who have been pushed out of school, because of our presence on school campuses and just our ability to really engage with different stakeholders, we've been invited to more spaces to be able to both lead and participate in different community efforts to just create more space for young people to affect change in systems and communities with their voices. And so the Oakland Reimagining Public Safety Task Force process was the perfect opportunity for us to really step in there and build on the work that we've been doing in direct service, but going beyond that direct service work. And so I'm sure most know the Reimagining Public Safety was really tasked with doing some rapid reimagining and reconstructing and with the goal of a 50% reduction of the Oakland Police Department General Purpose Fund to ensure that we're investing this money in alternative responses and programs that address root causes. And so some of our most fierce advocates, youth advocates in this community pushed to ensure that there were youth at the table, to ensure that there were youth a part of the task force. And so we were able to have 2 youth seats on the task force, but that wasn't enough. So also pushed to have a youth advisory board that would support these 2 youth on the task force, but also serve in an advisory capacity to the task force. And so we were invited by the city and our community partners to support with convening and facilitating this task force. And so we developed a strategy to support 15 youth members. And these are Fly youth, but also youth across Oakland. And so amazing young leaders who are doing great work in their community. And our goal was really to work alongside these young people, not to tell them what to do, you know, not to lead the way, but really to create space and to guide them. But to allow them to really step into a role and also to gather more youth input, because these 15 youth were strategically recruited, but they also had a task to gather more youth voices in the community. And so that looked like surveys, meetings, day and night, design activities, reports, data analysis, a lot of work, and it was all young people. It was all young people. And so we were just very fortunate to be able to support and work alongside them.
I love it. And if I could just offer a little bit of note of personal pride for like all of the work that that you really did, you and your team did, alongside the young people. Like I think about when we were first coming to Alameda County, first coming into Oakland, how we had to prove ourselves in some of the most high need schools. And we had to prove that both we were culturally competent, that our curriculum would speak to the young people. And here we are 6 years later, being asked by the city to sort of help to elevate the voice of young people in this important part of the important political process. So thank you for that work. So my last question for you is, because it was quite a political process, you spoke a little bit of how sort of like the decisions were really, I think, precipitated by the city's decision to reduce funding to the police force. So what was it like to play a part in such a political process?
Yeah, well, first, I mean, it was really important to be a part of this process. Reimagining is what we all must do right now. We can no longer operate the same as we have been. We know it's not working. And so reimagining really allows us the space to dive in ways to fight against these oppressive systems like policing, and really give more to community and build on the assets of our community. And so as we talk about prioritizing school safety, we know that what happens at the city level, or what doesn't happen at the city level for that matter, can directly impact our schools. Just today, actually, I was on a call getting an update about the Oakland Department of Violence Prevention. And part of the task force work was pushing for more funding into the Department of Violence Prevention. And so that was a win that the task force accomplished, of supporting to get $18 million diverted from the police department to the Department of Violence Prevention. Yep. And some of this money will directly impact schools and young people. And so that was a win for progress there. But you know what, the most exciting part of the work, while this was very much so a political process, was our young people. And you know, this is what kept me up all night with excitement, was seeing our youth step up and lead. Because, you know, there was a lot of back and forth with adults. This was a tough process. You have folks coming from different backgrounds, different lived experiences, different perspectives. And our young people played a role of really honoring that, and really centering the task force, and really taking a pause and helping everyone to focus and come together, and really led the way for the other task force members and for the other advisory board members. And so I was just really taken aback of how our youth would like cut straight through all the noise, and we're like, this is what we need to do. And everyone's like, okay. And so listening to our youth is not something that we can just say, but it is a critical action that we all need to do in order to get to real transformation. And so I'm excited that we have one of our youth here today who we get to hear from a little bit more about that process.
Me too. So let's get to it. Thank you so much, Jamila. I'm going to now turn to Ivan, Youth Advisory Board member. So Ivan, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Hey, so glad to have you here. I understand you're up in Davis now, taking time out from your classes to be here with us virtually. So thank you. I also want to say, Ivan, just to sort of double click on Jamila's point, I had the pleasure of seeing you in the task force present your recommendations, the advisory board present your recommendations to the task force. And I was really just blown away by just everything, just sort of like the thoughtfulness, just how prepared and just how on point y'all were. And I know that I wasn't alone, because I know that what you heard from the task force is that y'all set a standard. Y'all set a standard for the other subcommittees to follow. So really thank you for that work. So, tell us about your experience as the co-chair of that youth advisory board, and why was this work important to you personally?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for that question. First of all, I just want to reiterate everything Jamila said around, FLY's facilitation help with the Youth Advisory Board. We really made it a mission to center the voices of young folks throughout Oakland. And we did that, but it wouldn't have been without the help of FLY and the facilitation that you all provided. So I'm really grateful for you all. I want to tackle the second question first, of why this work is important to me. I grew up in Oakland. I grew up with a single mother. And so, I hold my personal story as my guiding value. My father was involved in gang violence for almost all of his life, from the time, he was back in high school. He was involved, in the streets and drugs and everything that comes with that. And so I went into this work after the events of 2020, and I was really galvanized to take action, not only in the streets, but in the political structure. And so I had the amazing opportunity to be appointed to the task force. And so I hold the story of, my father, not because it's just my father, but because I know that it's, children who are struggling with the same story across the nation who, have been affected by all of these different forms of violence within our communities. And I often think about, what it would have been like had my father had resources from the time he was in high school to get him off of the streets, to support him in getting to school, not skipping class. And so I held a lot of that with me when I was sitting on the task force. And I think it's just a story that we hear much too often. And then in terms of actually sitting on the, advisory board and on the task force, Jamila said it was very politicized at times, but it was work that really needed to be done. And so I really found comfort in the youth advisory board, which was comprised of so many different, young people who brought their own shared identities to the space. And so, just to highlight a couple amazing things we did, we had about 400 survey responses from youth across Oakland, 65% of which identified as BIPOC. And so we really did the work to engage young folks throughout Oakland who were coming from communities that are over-policed, from communities that are facing all of these forms of violence. And so I think that we definitely, like you said, set a precedent for the task force. And I hope for other, cities who want to do this process as well.
Yeah, that is amazing. I just want to double click on some stuff you said. So you were able to survey 400 Oakland students, able to elevate the voice of 400 Oakland students to play some important role in reimagining public safety in the city. 2/3 of those, 65% of 2/3 of them being Black, Indigenous people of color. So young people of color, which make up the majority of the city, were able to lend their voice to this important process. That's amazing. Thank you for that. So my follow-up question for you is, when we talk about reimagining public safety, particularly school safety is a key part of that. What recommendations around school safety came out of the task force? And what are you most proud of as someone who led the voice of young people?
Yeah, definitely. So there's, at the end of the reimagining process and after surveying all of those folks and holding space for so many different community members, we came up with a robust list of recommendations, which I'm sure, I think they were posted in the chat. But there were some that were specific to schools. I want to highlight a few of them. The first one was to take police out of Oakland schools, which is something you've touched on, Ollie, and something that, I think a lot of municipalities across the country are going through and struggling with at the same time. And so replacing those with violence interrupters and, restorative justice circles and folks who are actually engaging in the work is extremely important. We really touched on restorative justice, diversion programs, and then also making the link between, schools and community, an important relationship. Like Jamila said, relationships are at the heart. And so, we have to engage within the larger community and not just these school environments. And maybe that looks like bringing in resource fairs and job fairs into a school from different community members. And so there are so many different things that came out of that report that I'm really grateful for, like investing in, youth services and youth programs. And for me personally, I'll just add this last bit. I think it is just really important. Like Jamila said, relationships are extremely important. And then for me, it's just investment in our children in schools, period. In the richest country in the world, it makes no sense that we are, losing countless children to the streets when we could be funding our public schools and our school system adequately instead of funding other programs that, are controversial, but.
Thank you so much. And I know that many of those recommendations were adopted as standalone policies or priorities for the city, and some were incorporated into other things. But I just want to commend y'all for being so both forward, progressive in your thinking and out of the box. You hit on a lot of really great things about sort of culture and community, and that playing a role in creating school safety. And I know that our next panelist is going to really speak to that. So I look forward to chatting with her. But thank you so much, Ivan. I really appreciate your work.
Thank you.
Yeah. So now I want to shift over to Ebony. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for. Are you there? Yeah, perfect. Thank you for joining us. I know that you are literally coming from teaching class. I really appreciate you being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I think you heard some of Jamila and Ivan's insights, which I know mirror yours. But I really want to just really dig in and hear a little bit from you. So tell us about your work, particularly as it relates to young people that Fly work with. And in that, in your experience, what are some of the most common ways that you've seen young people pushed out of school and into the pipeline of prison?
Yes. So I'm currently doing forensic social work. So I'm working as a part of the legal defense team with defense attorneys to defend youth when they get criminal cases. And so my work could be it's sort of broad. I'm writing reports like mitigation, doing mitigation reports, doing disposition reports, weighing in on what should happen when upon release, doing release plans. I'm also spending a lot of time really getting to know young people and their families, learning about them to sort of give the court a more holistic perspective to weigh when they're making decisions. And so in a nutshell, that's what I'm doing. And I work with a number of youth that do have Fly mentors. And those mentors are awesome. They're super on top of, making sure kids are getting to court, making sure that they're getting the services they need in community, they're connecting with them at the schools. I mean, it's like really important work, especially when kids are getting pushed out a lot. Yep. And so I think there's many, many ways that young people are pushed out of school, particularly Black students are pushed out of school. Some of the things I'm seeing, I think some of the larger issues, school closures, gentrification, I mean, literally putting people out of their home puts people out of their schools. So there's, that there's a direct connection with that. But also like at the school level, I think too often the teaching force that is representative in schools that are predominantly color, and I believe that over 50% of schools in this country are full of students of color, but like 80% of the teaching force are white, largely white women. And a lot of times teachers are not prepared to come and work in environments where, it's predominantly Black and brown youth. So there's cultural mismatches, which then lends itself to cultural misunderstandings, misrepresentation of student behavior. There's power dynamics that happen in the class where because a teacher doesn't feel comfortable, I'm now pushing this student out of my classroom, be that through just you can't come in here, be that through me targeting you while you're in the class or ignoring you while you're in the class, or be through, the school suspending or expelling students, which again directly pushes them into the streets. I've also seen situations where Students who have individualized education plans, they're receiving special education. Their accommodations are not being met properly, and that could be because their schools are not resourced adequately to support them. Also the curriculum is not necessarily always reflected or taught in a way that is accessible to a wide variety of a diverse group of students, diverse learning needs as well as diverse cultural backgrounds. And so students, if they don't feel like they can learn, if they don't feel seen or represented, they're not going to go to class. They're not going to be in the class. And I also just kind of think like schools not being resourced adequately, sets students really and teachers up. It sets folks up to not be prepared. And so, I've also seen a chronic teacher vacancies where there's no teacher actually in the classroom. There's a sub, and sometimes you can't even get a sub. So students literally have periods where they're going to class and there's no one there to teach them. That, you can't stay in class like that, And last, I'll just mention, I think, it's good. I really appreciate what Ivan was saying, Jamila was talking about with like not having police on schools, campuses, at least in OUSD anymore and other places in the country. That's so important because that's another way to, just the over policing of our communities. Certainly if you've got police on campuses, students don't want to be in proximity to that, so that this narrative of like we need to control, like have social control over Black and brown people, students' bodies, that type of behavior is very antagonistic to their existence, to their well-being. And so that's furthermore pushing them out, having probation be a mechanism of, accountability, like schools calling probation officers and being like, look, come get this kid, or, it's that's directly pushing them into the juvenile legal system.
Yeah, I thank you. You said so much richness in there, and Ebony, and I want to just pull on a couple of things that I think were really particularly poignant to make sure that we don't lose them. So first, I really appreciate you taking a step back and reminding us of sort of the socio-ecological dynamics here, right? That we're not just talking about push out based on what's happening in school. We're talking about what's happening with our communities, displacement, gentrification, lack of investment in schools or communities, and how that also plays a role. So I really appreciate you starting there, because it's not just about the individual acts of kids, students, or even police officers or teachers. It starts bigger. That's the first thing. Then I think what I heard you say is this notion that, cultural competence or cultural intelligence or cultural collateral, if you will, like is a big part in creating an environment that's nourishing and enriching and safe, right? So if you've got, teachers, administrators not from the communities, no real accountability community, no understanding of the community, expecting to educate young people. It's not just about the textbooks. It's about how do you keep people safe? How do you connect with people? How do you build relationships? A lot of what we heard from Jamila earlier. So I want to call that out. And then I think the next thing that you said that I felt was really really poignant is this notion that when you talked about your job, the fact of the matter is you've got young people, Black and brown young people, who are being criminalized for disciplinary things. It's very similar to what Jamila's story, right? Two kids out getting into a fight, and all of a sudden it's a safety issue. Even though the fight was squashed and the kids are now working together, the next day one kid is expelled and has to go through expulsion here. So just the whole notion that in a lot of ways, like what might otherwise be considered as just normal school behavior gets criminalized in a way that pushes kids into the pipeline. So a lot there. I really appreciate you hitting on all of those key points. I want to ask you a question that sort of hopefully helps me and other folks on the call who's in this work, who's trying to make a difference. What can we do as a community to better support young people to engage in school, and to disrupt this pipeline, particularly for, as you mentioned, Black, Indigenous, people of colors?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think Ivan, said a lot, from the surveys that were done and what the young people were saying. I think listen to young people. So that's one thing. We need to listen to what they're saying that they need. So this notion of having, safety it goes beyond just, what's happening in the classroom. Like obviously it's like in the community, at home, into the classroom, out of the classroom, like all of it is connected. And so having, organizations like youth development organizations in working with the schools during the school day, as well as after school and beyond school hours, I think is key to holding our youth, holding a standard, holding them in love, holding them in care,
Mm.
being able to know, build relationships with them, and know what they're needing, so that we can then try to support them and resource them throughout. Like, as we know, a lot of kids, some aren't even eating until they go to school. And so, so then that means on the weekend, what's happening, where's their food coming from? And so I think, really, I think what Jamila is talking about with relationships really is where it's at, like building relationships with, with students, with families, with community members, people in the neighborhood, with community-based organizations, and all of us sort of pulling together from our particular positions and our particular roles to support the needs. And so, that includes like mental health agencies to
Yep.
support youth that are, needing to heal through, complex trauma issues that are ongoing. That means, having relationships with, I think someone mentioned the violence interrupters earlier,
Yep.
where we're not even just reacting to situations that happen in the moment, but like that are also doing preventative work, and us supporting them with that, like building like strategic relationships that way. I think also it's important to be very deliberate in hiring staff, teachers, the culture keepers, principals, like hiring folks that are representative of and reflective of the community, and not just in color, but like in experience, in like in area code, like if
Mm.
you have people from your community that you live in community with them, and you can see them, on your campus, there's a level of like continuity with that care, and there's a way that you kind of hold your head up more, because you're taking care of, and there's a way that you hold yourself accountable more, so I think the school district, it would be great if the school district was able to really prioritize, um, hiring
Yeah.
community to be on campus. And there's a lot of other there's more ideas to be had
Yeah.
and shared.
I was hoping you'd get to that last point, because when we talked a little bit about yesterday, I was particularly inspired by this idea. And I think this is probably getting to Karen's question, like this idea that, the community should have a presence on a campus, right? Like this idea that you hire people who are culturally competent from the community, who have credibility, and they can play a role in keeping folks safe. So I really love that idea. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about that, because you talked about it from a workforce development standpoint, which I think makes a lot of sense, right? It's kind of what Ivan was saying: create jobs for people who can actually culturally competently, create safety and create a climate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think this, like the violence interrupters in Jamila could help, like the technical definition. But my understanding of violence interrupters are they are people who have had life experience, who are from the communities that our youth are from, and who have the capacity, the skills to help negotiate peace, essentially, in the midst of very volatile situations where people's lives are threatened, people's lives are being taken, and that takes a very um, like particular skill set,
Yep.
and a lot of time, like I don't have that skill. I have some skills, but I don't have that particular skill set. I think the district is going to have to look outside of the way that they traditionally are, including people in the work of supporting our young people. Everyone's not going to necessarily pass a background check, and that's not that shouldn't be the standard for working with our young people. We need to build relationships with people. So the violence interrupters are people who can really support keeping our people alive. And the city employs them to do that. So that's my understanding of violence interrupters, but in terms of like, building, I think you were asking me following up about like, how do we, what were you saying? Like build, what were you saying?
Yeah, I was sort of, I think, paraphrasing. Well, let me first say, Jamila and Ivan, if you don't mind coming on camera so we can officially transition into the sort of Q&A for the audience. And y'all can certainly speak to the violence interrupter point, but to your point, Ebony, I was asking you to expound on this idea that, and you talked a little bit about bringing community members to the campus. I think what you talked about yesterday was how OUSC has this vision for community schools. They partner with nonprofits and service providers, organizations, but they should really be thinking about how to bring community members on campus in a way that helps create the culture and climate that's conducive to learning. So I was sort of asking you to expound on that, but I think you did hit on that. I think double clicking on this violence interrupters, I think is where there's energy. So I don't know if Jamila or Ivan, you want to respond to that question about who are the right folks, who are the appropriate folks to be these violence interrupters? I think it was Karen's question. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Karen.
Yeah, and really, I think Ebony answered it. It's the folks that live in these communities, folks who have family, friends, where they have close connections to folks who are involved, who are deeply impacted by the things that are happening. And so Ebony really spoke to that, and how I see this with Fly. We're working with some of these young people that could be violence interrupters. And so, when I'm thinking about Fly's role, how we're supporting our young people to see themselves as assets in their community and to be able to take their experience and what they've been through and turning that into a way that they can give back to their community.
Yeah, and if you don't, I'll jump in here quickly. I was really inspired. There was a story that came out of a Louisiana high school about how some kids were fighting. And I don't know if you all saw this, but some dads decided to patrol the school, and immediately after that, the fight stopped. So I'm not saying bring dads into the conversation, but I'm saying that when you have folks who look like you, who understand your struggle, I think it's extremely important. And I think in terms of when we talk about policing as well, officers need to know what issues the community is facing and be able to relate to the community. And I think the same could be applied to, our schools.
Yeah, I want to shout out Tina for that very quick and very clever Dads on Duty quiz. So thank you, Tina. Well, let's continue because Karen had a clarifying question for you, Jamila, about your story. It was, and I'm going to pull up the question. So it's, was the expulsion hearing at the school incorporating restorative justice principles in order to allow for this outcome?
No, it did not incorporate restorative justice principles. So I appreciate you for raising that because, and I think I saw another message in there, we need restorative justice. But that wasn't the experience of this expulsion hearing. And it actually makes me emotional to think about this expulsion hearing because it was the first one that I participated in. And it was very intense. And just seeing our youth have to literally fight to stay in school. They wanted to be in school. They wanted to finish school. This was already an expulsion school. Where were they going next? And so the youth really advocated for themselves, had their family there. And then their Fly case manager was there and I was also there. And it was a situation where like, look, these youth are good. They're at a community service event. There's no risk right now. And so it was a situation where that was heard and a decision was made to not expel based on that, but definitely could have been a restorative process that was involved there that wasn't.
Yeah, it's funny because it made me think of a long time ago when I was in high school. I used to fight a lot as a high school student. I was angry about a lot of stuff. And, one of the strategies that they applied was to put me in mediation training so that I could be a mediator. So as a kid who fought a lot, it's like, we want you to help mediate these other kids to fight. And so I remember Mr. Gillis was the coordinator of the mediation training. And at first I was like, this makes no sense. And then eventually, like, I got into it. I understood that it was really about just seeing the other side. And so I love this sort of out of the box thinking around how do you sort of resolve conflict between young people in a way that's not criminalizing the fact that they have conflict. And, someone else mentioned the point that restorative justice was not a concept, or at least not a popular concept when I was in high school. But the idea that we teach our kids to love and forgive and atone and account for harm we've done, and yet that's not how we approach school management or classroom management. It's more about discipline and enforcing and maintaining control, right? And so it's an interesting concept, and I really appreciate the insights that y'all are providing. So there's one more question, and we have time for others, but our very own Dick Watts asked this very poignant question that I want to just pose. Certainly want to hear from you, Ivan, but anybody. So, do teachers understand how their relationships with students can play a role in disrupting the pipeline of prison? And if not, is FLY helping to educate them? That's actually a question for all three of you. Ivan or Ebony could probably really speak to it as a partner in the work.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's extremely dependent on the teacher. I think it varies from case to case. I think we have some phenomenal educators who realize the role that they have and the power that they hold. And I think we have educators who are unsure. And that's not because they don't want to be unsure. In most cases, I think it's because they haven't undergone that training. And so, I'll let Jamila touch on what FLY is doing specifically to train those teachers. But, from an outside perspective, I think it's extremely dependent. And I think that regardless of whether we think someone is, understanding the role they play, I think that training is necessary regardless of the situation. And I think it should be done.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think Ebony could actually speak to training piece, but as far as FLY's role, what I'm thinking about right now is, in our law program, we're in the schools, in the classrooms with the teacher weekly. I'm thinking of a school site where I just visited a couple of weeks ago, and the teacher is sitting with us, helping us teach the class, working with the youth, doing the activities with them, right? And so I see our role as when we come into the classroom, we're also inviting the teachers to be a part of what we're doing. I think about at the end of our law program, we have a recognition ceremony where we just appreciate and celebrate our youth and highlight their strengths. And so sometimes we're saying things that these teachers never thought about and saw because they're very focused on the classroom management. What are they doing? What are they doing wrong? And they're like, wait a minute, this youth said all this, they did all this. And so I see our role as supporting teachers and being able to see our youth as humans, as people that have a lot of strengths and talents and really deserve to be supported in that way.
Thank you, Jamila. Ebony, you want to take us home on this question?
I think that's a beautiful question, and I really agree and appreciate what both Ivan and Jamila shared. I think, and I believe that there are some teachers that are equipped, and there are many that are not. I think teacher education programs have to be very deliberate about addressing that there is a problem of school to prison pipeline that actually exists, that there are systemic factors that are beyond the individual teacher, and that we need to be aware of that as we approach our practice as teachers. As the class that I was teaching is a class for new teachers. I teach it's like an introduction to special education, but I teach it from a perspective of certainly critical race theory, but like a perspective of recognizing that cultural wealth and having an analysis around diversity being something that teachers need to accommodate and create pathways for in their classroom, create space for, that is something that is essential to the well-being of not just students with disabilities, but all students, so being very strength based. I think if teachers can be trained to identify the strengths in students, even for students acting a fool, even for students who give you a hard time, being able to see what their strengths are. And maybe sometimes even like that, some of their acting a fool is a strength. Like Ali, you mentioned them putting you in that in the mediation program because you were fighting. That is the kind of, I think, mindset that we want our teachers to take. And so, yeah, I just think it's like got to be more deliberate in teacher education programs. I'm teaching in the urban education and social justice program at USF, and I think that cohort of that department tries to be intentional about having that kind of an analysis. But we need that to have that be the analysis across all of our teacher education programs.
I was on mute there. Thank you so much for that, Ebony. And I see we've got a couple of questions from Kim. So thank you, Kim, for asking. One question I'm going to try and answer here, or I'm going to ask Jamila to help me answer. The other, I think we'll take offline and probably follow up with you. So your question so the question is, when relationships are your secret sauce at the core of how you help stop that school of prison pipeline, how do you think about the question of scaling your programming to other schools or other locations? Or is it a matter of going and staying deep in a few places? And I feel like, Jamila, you and I can both answer the question with two different perspectives. I feel like we'll meet somewhere in the middle, like rivers. So when I think about, in Oakland, when we came in Alameda in Oakland 5-6 years ago, we had this idea that we were going to run one or two programs that we knew would work in this community, right? But when we got here, we saw the opportunity for change, to build relationships. And so we added more programs. But then we saw that, what we really wanted to do was sort of empower young people to be agents of change in the community. And so we started adding youth voice initiatives. So I feel like the answers are both in. I feel like you come in with what you know works, but as you learn more about what the community needs, if you're able to provide it, you figure out how to provide that. Thoughts about that in terms of scaling and deep commitments to the communities that you're in that have an impact?
Yeah, I would agree with what you said, Ali. Also, kind of building on, we're doing direct service, but also thinking about us going beyond just the direct service. We're seeing other ways to deepen our relationships. So we're in different spaces with different other community organizations and other people. Ebony and I are in a group chat where we're talking about what's happening in the community all the time and seeing different opportunities where we can utilize and leverage our relationships in community. And so I think I see Fly's role expanding, but that doesn't always mean expanding programs or expanding locations, but expanding the way in which that we work in community.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And Kim, I promise that we'll follow up on your question about whether or not we're seeing a similar sort of openness to this sort of approach in new communities. But I want to leave time for each member to answer this one final question before I kick it back to Katie. So starting with you, Ebony, this final question is, what is your, so we talked a lot about what's not working, what's showing promise. So I'd love to hear from you in a minute or less. What's your vision? In your view, what does an educational experience that drives towards academic success and school safety for young people look like?
Strong relationships. Strong relationships with families, with students, with community, and an understanding from an institutional level that our students don't need to be controlled but guided, and that they have a right to do that. Teacher education programs that are recruiting teachers from communities where the schools are, and training them to be responsive to the needs of the community, to the needs of the young people, very, very intentionally. And, like just very clear career pathways, for young people, I really believe that there should be, kind of like Jamila mentioned, there should be pathways for young people to take on some of the roles that we want professionals, like adults, to be taking on. Like, we want these students to sort of become Jamila and become Ebony. We want them to do that. So creating the pathway for that to happen, and also making sure that there's a plan for young people once they're done with school. What are they? How are we setting them up for the next level? Like, college is one thing, but that's not everything. So how are we connecting young people with opportunities, and how are we leveraging our relationships in the community to make sure that those opportunities are abundant?
Yeah, thank you for that, Ebony. Ivan, same question, and I'll repeat it. In your view, what does an educational experience that drives towards academic success and school safety for our young people look like?
Yeah, thank you. Definitely agree with Ebony. I think I touched on it earlier. First of all, I don't believe that we can achieve academic success without first strongly investing in our schools, period. Like, that is a fundamental part of academic success. And I think beyond that, I think we also have to think about preparing young students for life outside of just academics, like Ebony said. So, I often think about resources as simple as financial literacy and life skills that will, help students navigate the world, and I think, allow them to step into a different scene rather than just academics. So I think a combination of all of those things will truly be able to not reform, but do some changes to the academic system as it is now, and definitely not punishing students for behavior. I think that is a very outdated system, as we have talked about all night.
Yeah. Thank you. Finally, Jamila, same question.
Yeah. Well, I love those responses. I definitely echo that. And, I'm thinking again about this group chat that me and Ebony are in, hearing about things that are going on in the community, at our schools, with our young people, and the response of everybody in this group chat are responding with the needs of these youth. Like, these are our kids. Like, literally, this is my child. And so I'm just envisioning, our community really seeing our youth like they are our own. Not like they're those criminals, bad kids, not like they're a threat, right? But simply they're our kids, they're our youth. And I want our youth to, feel that. And that's feeling care and love. That's feeling emotionally safe. That's just feeling a part of a community. And, I love the questions about and the comments about restorative principles. I'm seeing educational experience being more restorative and less punitive. Curriculum is culturally responsive. And so, we're learning about who I am as an individual, where I come from, the world around me. I envision youth being excited about learning and engaged in dialogue and discussion, and where they're really owning their learning and stepping into leadership roles in schools like Ivan did, right? And so, and having their families be a part of that and being a part of that educational journey.
So inspiring. Well, thank you, Jamila, for your leadership, all you do for FLY and for the community. Thank you, Ebony, for all you do to sort of, promote a better academic experience for training teachers to be better at their jobs and be more culturally competent. And Ivan, thank you for all your leadership, elevating youth voice, and making sure the youth voice plays an important part of this important conversation. So thank you all. Turn it over to Katie at this point.
Thank you all so much for coming tonight and learning more about prioritizing school safety and FLY's work to build relationships that really help youth thrive in school. Here are a few ways that you can get involved with FLY and these efforts. First, follow us on social media, sign up for our email list at our website, flyprogram.org. Also, consider donating to FLY's Justice Prevails Fund. This is a $1.5 million campaign that supports important aspects of our work. community responsive innovations, youth voices for change, and statewide impact. To learn more, please visit our website, and the Justice Prevails Fund there's more information there for you. We would love to tell you more, and feel free to email me at katie@flyprogram.org. I'm happy to share more with you. And finally, stay tuned for the next segment of Movement for Justice of the series. It will be happening in the new year in February. So we hope to see you there. We thank you so much for coming tonight and joining in this movement with us. Have a great night.